Hello there. Today's video is about tomahawks. We are going to be examining some recreations and going over the history surrounding them. But before we do that, I think it's important to talk about the word. Tomahawk is an Algonquin word that just means axe. In the old sense, it could equally refer to something like this, or something like this, or to any one of these. Modern definitions are similarly unhelpful. For example, here we see a very disparate group of axes, and yet the term tomahawk could be equally applied to any of them. As always, it's best not to be too pedantic with things. Let's move on to the history. I'm just going to talk about the metal axes in this video, as I've done a previous video about other axes. There's a common misconception that before the Europeans came over here, we had no metalworking. This is not true. Metal smelting was unknown apart from a few of the larger nations such as the Aztecs, the Maya, and the Inca. Metal smithing was done just about everywhere, to varying degrees of frequency. Metal smelting was unneeded except in the larger nations because of the existence of native copper. And copper axes like this, though by no means ubiquitous, were not all that uncommon. Here's my recreation. I cold forged it out with a rock for a hammer, which is why it's a little bit rough. It's quite small as I couldn't get my hands on a decent sized piece of copper, but so too are many of the surviving examples. The head could be attached to the handle in one of two ways. It could be socketed into the point of a root, similar to the Utsi axe or my antler axe. Alternatively, it could be wedged into a handle similar to a celt. I know some of you are going to want to see how well it cuts, so here's a quick test. The blade is very sharp and cuts into the wood very well. The drawback is that because the blade is so thin and light, it doesn't hit very hard. More efficient than the stone or the antler axe, less efficient than steel. So that's all I have to say about the pre-Columbian tomahawk. Let's move on. When the first Europeans came over here, they found that they could get a lot of furs for many of the objects they considered commonplace. Initially, one of the most valued commodities were steel axes. Initially, these were just ship's axes, boarding axes and the like, but once a few of the colonies got established and the fur trade really got going, they started to mass-produce axes with the sole purpose of trade. Many of these axes were of abysmal quality because having a monopoly on steel, they could get away with it. Once we had a fair few steel axes, though, the demand for them dropped and the traders were forced to up their game, start producing decent quality stuff again. Additionally, many nations sent out apprentices to learn how to smith and bring it back home, further reducing the need for foreign traders. One of the features of these trade axes was a handle that is inserted through the top of the head rather than through the bottom, as is common in axes. In these handles, the top of the handle is the thickest part, preventing the head from sliding off. Initially, this was a feature of ship's axes. On the ocean, everything is subject to frequent humidity changes. A handle might shrink or expand unexpectedly. With this style of construction, even if the head becomes loose, it's not going to go flying off. The traders stuck with this design because it's a lot easier to manufacture than a standard S-shaped handle. And if you got a monopoly, you can get away with anything. Oftentimes, when we bought a trade axe, we just take the old crummy handle out and replace it with one of our own. We stuck with the basic design, though, because it's greatly beneficial when throwing a tomahawk. Throwing is really hard on a handle, but with this sort of construction, you can just tap it back into place and it's good as new. I made this axe back when I was 16 and I had no idea what I was doing, so this should represent the worst of the worst. I've worked it hard since then and it's held up, so even a bad axe is pretty good. Here's a better quality reproduction trade axe. The way these are made is by taking a strip of flat stock, bending it around a mandrel and then welding it together before forming the blade. A small piece of higher carbon steel is welded between the two halves to form the bit. This axe head took less than an hour to forge, so if you were so inclined you could really churn these out. The blade is very thin and light. It uses a lot less metal relative to other axe designs, which is beneficial if you're looking to make a quick buck. It's almost useless as a splitting axe, but it's very good for wood carving, I've found. The thin blade bites in very deeply, lets you whittle away large chunks of the wood. To compare against these trade axes, here's a modern hatchet. The blade is a lot thicker, the whole thing is a lot heavier. The eye is shaped like a teardrop rather than like a circle. The transition from blade to eye is a lot less abrupt, and there's a thickened section at the back for pounding on or using as a hammer. If you want to be pedantic, you could say this is a hatchet and not a tomahawk. But I bet you'd have called it a tomahawk if you saw a Mohawk warrior carrying it around 250 years ago. The next thing we're going to look at is called a spontoon tomahawk. This is essentially a spear blade attached to an axe handle. Unlike other tomahawks, this one cannot be used as a tool, it is only a weapon. It's forged in a similar method to the trade axe, being a piece of flat stock that's forged around a mandrel and welded together. These often lacked the hardened bit. Because you aren't going to be cutting wood in them, edge retention isn't so important. The flared out sections behind the blade are partially for decoration, but partially to prevent the blade from going deeper than necessary into a body. They're common, but not universal. Maybe a third of the ones I've seen don't have them. Because they are only of use as a weapon, not as a tool, spontoon tomahawks were nothing like as popular as others. However, because they were dedicated weapons, many of them became highly decorated, very prestigious items. The final sort that we're going to look at is the pipe tomahawk. This was one of the ways that the traders started to up their game. Okay, you've got some of those cheap, crummy little axes. Yeah, I admit you don't need any more of those. But look at this. It's beautiful, it's well crafted, and, best of all, you can smoke out of it. You want this. Now, I've heard a story regarding the invention of the pipe tomahawk. It goes that one day a blacksmith was poking around in his supplies looking for something to recycle into a tomahawk when he comes across a broken gun barrel. Gun barrels back in the day were formed by taking a strip of metal and then coiling it around a mandrel, welding it as you go. Sort of like a cardboard tube. Because forge welding is tricky, especially under these circumstances, gun barrels were prone to rupturing. To offset this, gunsmiths would make their barrels from much thicker metal than is strictly necessary. So the blacksmith says, fine, I'll make it out of a gun barrel. It should be pretty strong, and the welds will make a nice pattern on the blade. So he drifts a hole in it, welds one end shut over a harder bit, but then he's left with this awkward hole at the other end. And he thinks, I kind of like the look of that. And I'll put a hollow handle in it too, and it'll be a fun little novelty. It'll be a pipe tomahawk. And the result sold like hotcakes. Literally everybody wanted one. The pipe tomahawk quickly became to us what the sword was to Europeans. We often see portraits of people just holding a tomahawk as set dressing, similar to the way a European monarch might rest his hand on his saber. One explanation I've heard frequently to explain the tomahawk's popularity is that it represents the duality of war and peace. I don't know if that's true, but it makes a bit of sense. However, it could have been something as simple as just cool factor. To enhance the prestige, many of these pipe tomahawks were very ornately decorated, either with silver plaques, brass studs, wirework, or carvings. But there were also plenty of more modest examples. All this prestige comes at a cost, though. A pipe tomahawk is much less useful as a tool than other sorts. The hollow handle is much less suitable for absorbing heavy impacts. The pipe bowl means that the back of the head can't be used as a hammer. I remember seeing a tomahawk where the pipe had been almost completely mashed into the body. I can imagine that poor fellow's frustration when he finds his kid's been using it to drive nails. I've seen some people online talking about the offensive capabilities of the pipe bowl. These people are forgetting something very important, namely that you have to smoke out of this. You don't want to get bits of people stuck in there. For those of you who are interested, the way you hollow out a handle is you find a branch or a sapling with a spongy pith down the center. This will help guide your drill bit and keep it from going out the side. I would be remiss if I didn't mention throwing. A common tactic was to follow up a volley of muskets with a charge, throwing a tomahawk or two before closing with the enemy. Tomahawks are very well suited for throwing. The handle gives your throws a lot of power, and the way that they're weighted makes it relatively easy to judge whether or not the blade is going to stick in. at least when compared to a knife. Most tomahawks weigh about a pound, so even if the blade doesn't stick in, they still hit with a lot of force. The only drawback is that you can only carry about 4 at a time, and once you've thrown them, you might not get them back, so you'd only throw the cheap, ugly ones. Another great benefit of throwing tomahawks is that they bounce unpredictably when hitting the ground. You can imagine the psychological effect of seeing a load of blades spinning along the ground towards your shins while your enemies charge at you. I'd imagine you'd have a pretty hard time aiming. Well, that's just about all I have to say. I hope you enjoyed or at least learned something. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.